everyone. My name is Buell. I'm the Schenectady County historian. I'm here today with John Gearing, a local attorney and author who has recently published a book, Schenectady Genesis: How a Dutch Colonial Village Became an American City, 1661 to 1800. The book is a follow-up to Susan Staffa's Volume 1. John's subtitle is Volume 2, The Creation of an American City from an Anglo-Dutch Town, 1760 to 1800. John, thanks for being with us today.
Well, Bill, thanks for having me.
You are a native of Bristol, Connecticut.
I am.
You went to Bates College, Georgia Tech, and then got your law degree at the University of Connecticut School of Law.
That's all correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you're a man of the world. I wanted to ask you, what was your first impression when you came to Schenectady about 15 years ago and saw the Stockade neighborhood?
Right. Well, actually, I want to say, Bill, it was probably 1998 or 9 when I first walked the sidewalks in the Stockade. And the occasion for that was that I had just purchased a new camera and a very nice small telephoto lens. And I just was looking for something, some subject matter to shoot. And I'd seen a poster called The Doorways of Dublin, I think. Dublin being Dublin, Ireland. And so I thought, well, I'd heard about this neighborhood in Schenectady, but I had never been there. So I drove down here from where I was living in Clifton Park, and parked somewhere in the Stockade, and managed to find a spot. And then I just started walking around with camera in hand, and just looking at the architecture, which, was amazing. There were so many. I shot tons of doorways, and I just, and I read the historical plaques, the ones on the buildings, the ones from the Education Commission from the 30s that are, on poles here and there, and learned a lot about, the beginnings of Schenectady and Schenectady history right there. And then I was gone for a number of years, and when I came back, I was living in Niskayuna, and of course a little closer to Schenectady than Clifton Park, and and I just had occasion to come down here more often, which kind of rekindled my interest in the Stockade and Schenectady's history.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now your book kind of picks up with the French and Indian War.
Right.
There's a little bit of overlap between you and Susan, right?
Yeah, there is because it seemed like a good place. I mean, Susan was trying to finish the whole history, both volumes, in time for the bicentennial of the city, and unfortunately, she became ill, and it interrupted her work, and she wasn't able to complete her dream. So she had to. Her book just ends where she finished her writing at that point. But when I was starting, I was looking for a good transition sort of spot to start from, and the end of the French Indian War looked like a really perfect place to start, even though it overlapped Susan a little bit, because at that point, it was from that point through to the Revolution that Schenectady really became involved in the fur trade. Things had opened up. Canada was no longer French. English or Scottish or American merchants could easily pass over to Niagara, to Detroit, and trade with Native Americans further west. So, and that brought a ton of business through Schenectady and really helped Schenectady develop. So I thought that was a good place to kind of start and then carry it on from there.
You have to tell people a little bit about what was going on before, so and that's why you overlap. So I'm going to go back a little bit.
Okay.
I came across this wonderful little quote in your book, September 1710, by the Reverend Thomas Barclay of the Church of England in Albany. I'm just going to read this quickly. At Schenectady, I preach once a month, where there is a garrison of 40 soldiers, besides about 16 English and about 100 Dutch families. They are all of them my constant hearers. I have this summer got an English school erected amongst them, and in a short time I hope their children will be fit for catechizing. Schenectady is a village situated upon a pleasant river 20 English miles above Albany, and the first castle of the Indians is 24 miles above Schenectady. In this village, there has been no Dutch minister these 5 years, and there is no probability of any being settled among them. There is a convenient and well-built church, which they freely gave me the use of. I have taken pains to show them the agreement of the articles of church with theirs. I hope in some time to bring them not only to be constant hearers, but communicants. So Reverend Barclay had some big plans for the Dutch people living in Schenectady. So talk a little bit about how the city was changing, the town was changing, let me correct myself.
Well,
And
yeah.
it was mostly the Dutch, but the English were coming.
Yeah, the English were kind of filtering in, I would say, 1660s when the colony changes over from Dutch governance to English governance. You would then start to see more English settlers, English business folks coming in, through what we would today we call New York, but they would have called like New Amsterdam, and starting to kind of filter up I would say they would most likely filter up the Hudson a bit, and acquiring if they're wealthy, they're acquiring lands. Otherwise, they're fitting in as tavern keepers, as shopkeepers, things like that, and definitely a little past the Reverend Barclay's time by the 1750s, 1755 era maybe, and a little before. Albany in particular was very well integrated between English and Dutch society. There were, I think the majority of tavern owners in Albany at that point were English. There were blacksmiths that were English. There were lawyers and doctors that were English. The English church was well established, and some of the Dutch elite had begun to attend services in the English church. It kind of, I want to say, I can't prove it, but my sense is that there may have been a little schism between the higher end of Dutch society and everyone else who stayed more loyal to Dutch culture and the Dutch Protestant Reformed Church, only in that the elite is going to be tending to want more political power and political gains, and since that's controlled by the English, you want to spend time with them and sort of fit into their world a little more. But Schenectady was still, for a long time, very, very, very Dutch, and very, comparatively few English folks, or folks from other countries for that matter, really came here. And the core down here in the stockade, I mean, you could even go back to the militia rolls and the Revolutionary War enlistment records and things, and see that in the village here, which known, the Dutch term the dorp, the English would maybe call it the burg. It was the names of the men who were involved in the military enlistment were almost entirely Dutch. And when you get up to places such as like Dwaynesburg and what's today Princetown, which was then Corey's Bush, then you're seeing German names and Scottish names and other nationalities. But the heart of Schenectady, the old village, that remained resolutely Dutch for a long time.
And what was the impact of the French and Indian War on our community? It was a long war, relatively. Mm-hmm. Was there just an ominous sense of fear throughout the whole time, or were we a little detached?
Well, I think we were somewhat detached. There had to be some concern, given Schenectady's history of the massacre in 1689-90, that something like that could happen again. But Schenectady was more of a base of operations when Colonel Bradstreet organized a relief expedition to go out to Lake Ontario and relieve the besieged British fort at that was at Oswego. He launched it from here with 500 boats and thousands of men and hundreds and tons of supplies. So I think Schenectady was kind of a base or a source of materiel to promulgate the war in the West. You had William Johnson, of course, and his Native American forces joining with the British regulars to attack Niagara, to attack Fort Frontenac, and those are all out on the Great Lakes. But Schenectady was sort of a support. I would think of it as more of a supporting place.
Mm-hmm. Turning to the American Revolution, John, tell us what it was like in Schenectady during the summer of 1777.
1777. So, Bill, you must be talking about the lead up to the pivotal battles at Saratoga, Schuylerville, where again, Schenectady. We had some Schenectady folks in the militia who were there, and Schenectady did have a regiment in the Albany County Militia. So a lot of those folks have been kind of drawn off up there. But at the same time, you've got the British forces under Barry St. Leger trying to march east from Niagara, and they get kind of held up at Fort Stanwix, investing Stanwix, the Battle of Oriskany. Schenectady's kind of caught in the middle between these things. And then you have, of course, as you've written about, the Normanskill battle.
The Great Battle of Normanskill.
The Great Battle of the Normanskill, which Schenectady militia but supported by, I think, wasn't it 40 or so troops from Rhode Island?
Connecticut? I'm not sure.
Connecticut or Rhode Island, who included quite a few African American soldiers who went down there and participated in that. And that seemed like that was sort of the Helderberg Loyalists and Tories trying to raise a force to march to Schenectady and have kind of a fifth column impact on the battle and draw forces away from the main American army to repel that, or maybe they even wanted to capture Albany at that point since forces had gone north. But the other thing that was going on in Schenectady was the hospital, because there was quite a bit of sickness. You get that many troops together, and you're going to have communicable diseases. And so Schenectady had a barracks that would hold, say, 600 men approximately, according to records. But the hospitals in Albany became overwhelmed, and the overflow began to be transported to Schenectady. And so Schenectady's barracks turned into the hospital. And so we had a couple of doctors here and some assistants caring for troops here. And oddly enough, I found a report from the Army on that summer and the medical aspect of it. And they list a lot of the illnesses that were being suffered, but you don't see smallpox among them, which I thought was a bit odd, because certainly up at Lake George, you had smallpox up there, other times in the war, but here it was mostly fevers, things like that, dysentery, of course. So I would say there's a couple of things going on here in Schenectady at that point. You had to be very nervous about St. Leger and his forces coming from the west, for sure, because you had the Tryon County militia out there, which Tryon County today was Fulton, Montgomery, and a little bit of Herkimer maybe put together. The county that William Johnson established before his death in 1774. Tryon County militia was trying to block St. Leger. But if they were to fail and St. Leger kept coming, this would be his next stop.
And there were Schenectadians who fought at the two battles of Saratoga?
Yes, if you go back through, say, Hanson's Schenectady and the Revolution, he cites several reports by Schenectadian militia who were present there, and you can track them back through military pension records and read their narratives of, what they did and where they were. Yeah, so we definitely had some folks up at Saratoga.
Tell us a little bit about Christopher Yates and the Committee of Correspondence. What was that all about?
Yeah, well, Christopher Yates, a very interesting fellow, a local man of the Yates family, which has long roots in Albany County, which Schenectady was part of Albany County in those days. And so the Yates family, I think we had sheriffs, we had militia captains. The first Yates had come over from England as an army detachment and married into a Dutch family, and that was kind of a pattern in the Yates family, was to marry into Dutch families. Christopher was a surveyor. He was probably a bit of a merchant and trader. He'd done some work with Sir William Johnson, and in the Revolution, initially he was elected as one of the leaders of that Committee of Correspondence or Committee of Safety, to kind of run town affairs. From a revolutionary standpoint, they supplanted town government. There really wasn't much of a town government at the time. It had kind of pretty much collapsed at that point. It had started nascent town government in the 1760s, but never really kind of took off. So yeah, he was doing that. He became quartermaster in the army, stationed I think mostly up in Saratoga, but quartermasters are responsible for getting supplies to the troops. So he was doing that, and he was also up in, let me think, he was up in Lake Ticonderoga area, leading in the lead up to the Battle of Saratoga. He was up there in charge of a force that would like delaying the British. They would cut down trees and block roads. I think they'd probably been operating sawmills up there to try to get lumber to build boats to take out on Lake Champlain and stop the British on the lake. But that having failed, they did a kind of a rearguard action, delaying the British. And by some accounts, they held the British up for a significant amount of time, which gave the American army time to gather its strength and get in position and get their own fortifications built farther south where the actual battles took place.
And I'm sure every good Schenectadian was an enthusiastic rebel.
Well, I think it was John Adams who said, a third were patriots, a third were supported Great Britain, and a third had no interest whatsoever. But you definitely had a core of ardent patriots here. But there were also folks with strong ties to England, either mercantile or family ties, or just identified strongly as English and just were not about to rebel against their king. So there were definitely folks from Schenectady who were taken and accused of not supporting the revolutionary cause, being adherents to the king. Most of them, I think just about all of them, either got off by taking an oath to defend the country against foreign invaders, which is kind of stopping short of saying you're strictly a patriot or not. It's kind of a middle ground. But folks like John Sanders across the river over there at the Glenn Sanders Mansion, he was originally in the Committee of Correspondence, Committees of Safety, and his first act at the first meeting was to resign. He got in trouble later on for refusing to accept paper money issued by the Continental Congress as payment for goods, which, again, he was supposed to do as a merchant, but he didn't want to do it, and someone complained, and he got called before the committee for that. Daniel Campbell, one of the leading fur traders here, was suspected, and he probably was he was from Ireland. Campbell family probably originally comes from Scotland. His carriage was decorated with the Campbell clan crest and so forth, but in his letters he at once mentions his home in Ireland, so perhaps Northern Ireland. But in any case, he had served in the British Army, as had John Duncan, another prominent merchant, and so those fellows were most likely going to be adherents to the king, but it was kept kind of low key. And like in Duncan's case, he owned extensive lands, and what he did was very, very clever. Is his son wanted to go and fight in the British Army, Captain Richard Duncan, for whom there's a chapter of the United Empire Loyalists in Canada named in his honor. And he did. He served in the British Army against the Americans. So you would think, well, ordinarily, patriotic Americans would, the patriotic government, the rebel government, would have taken his lands, considered him a traitor, but he held all his own lands jointly with his father, who did not profess to support the British Empire. And so they kind of skated around that problem, and none of his possessions were confiscated.
So Daniel Campbell basically sat on the fence throughout most of the 7-8 years?
I would like to say that's true, but there's a very interesting little gap in the historical record, because and we are making this podcast here in the library of the Schenectady County Historical Society, which is also producing the podcast, and for which we thank them. But here in their incredible archives is a copy, well, not a copy, it's the original of Daniel Campbell's letter book. And these are the letters he wrote as a merchant, and some personal letters, starting from about 1770 up until like through the I want to say the middle 1780s, and there's a gap, and the gap is sort of right in the years of the Revolutionary War.
How old is Daniel Campbell as when the war breaks out?
Well, Daniel
50s?
Campbell, let's see, he came to Schenectady in the early 1750s by his own admission, in which time he was probably in his 50s when the war broke out. I would imagine. A former officer in the British Army, as was John Duncan, who had his by that time he'd built his big mansion up where what do they call it, Mansion Square Shopping Center is today in Niskayuna, and the big house that's kind of in the back of that big brick mansion, which was moved. It was amazing they were able to move it without it falling apart, but it was moved to its present location. That was not his house. That was built later. His house was destroyed in a fire in the early 1800s. But yeah, these guys, and the interesting story about Duncan is it just demonstrates how sometimes you have to double check things, because I think it's in Hanson's Schenectady and the Revolution. There's a story about Washington writing to the Committee of Safety here, concerned that Duncan has a stock of firearms, of muskets, at his residence, and Hanson takes that as a suggestion that Duncan may have been trying to raise a counter-revolutionary militia. However, if you go back to the Washington's actual letters, which are all online, and you can find that letter and you can read it, and that wasn't the case at all. Washington was looking to acquire weapons for the army he was creating, and he heard that Duncan still had a bunch of weapons in a warehouse, and he was actually asking them to find out what he wanted for them so they could buy them.
Do you make an important distinction between the term Loyalist and the term Tories?
I had a feeling you were going to get to that, Bill. We've talked about that. We've talked about that a couple of times. Some folks say that the term Tory was reserved for folks who were actually born overseas in England, Scotland, or Ireland, Wales, and who remained loyal to the king, and that Loyalists were folks maybe who were born here or who were born in another country who emigrated to America and were loyal to the king. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's one distinction I've read drawn there. Yeah.
I'd love to ask this question of all our Sir William Johnson fans that we have out there in this area. He dies in 1775.
Yeah.
Paint us a scenario for what happens if he had lived.
Wow. Well, if Johnson had lived, well, that's very interesting. He was in charge of Indian affairs. He is very close with the Iroquois nation, and through them, other Native American nations further west and south. It seems likely, given his position and his family connections, and the extent to which he went to send his son to England for schooling, and of course his son Sir John was knighted. Johnstown is actually named for his son John Johnson, and he married into a prominent New York English family. So I mean, my sense is that he would certainly have supported the king and probably had done similar things to what his son did, which was to be his son was not the Indian commissioner at the time. That was Johnson's nephew, Guy. But Guy and Sir John worked closely together, and Sir John ended up being the colonel of a regiment of the King's Royal Regiment of New York, or the King's Yorkers. Mm-hmm. Most largely composed of folks who are either recent arrivals from England, Ireland, or Scotland, or ex-British military, or they probably drew heavily from the Highland settlers of William Johnson's lands there in Kingsbury. So I think Sir William would have been the colonel of that regiment, more than likely, and he would have included the Native Americans, in his forces, and they, trusting him as they did, I'm sure, as they did his son, except for the Oneida and some Tuscarora, the Iroquois nation was allied with the English.
And before he moved west, he was an important figure in Schenectady.
Now, which was
William Johnson.
Oh, William Johnson. Well, I mean, he was an important figure in Schenectady. There's a letter in the Sir William Johnson papers from a Schenectadian saying that he heard that Johnson was looking to buy a house here, and he's offering his house to Johnson. And it's quite a detailed description of what a house in Schenectady would have looked like and the dimensions of it in the 1740s. But Johnson doesn't really spend much time here. He passes through to go and settle his uncle's lands out in what they called Warrensburg then, which is pretty close to where Fonda is today, on the south bank of the Mohawk. But Johnson quickly realizes that the place to be is on the north bank. It's better for communication further west. He gets a quick grasp of the whole Indian trade situation. And before you know it, he's writing to his uncle asking for trade, money to buy trade goods with, or asking his uncle to send trade goods. And Johnson's becomes a big force in the fur trade. And to that extent, he's kind of competing with Schenectady traders and Albany traders. But at that point, he's not commissioner of Indian Affairs. That doesn't come till later. Mm-hmm. But he does complain at times about the problems of getting justice in what we think of today as upstate or Albany County, which Albany County was pretty much everything from, north of Kingston just about, to wherever Canada started and as far west as the Iroquois nations, because over ethnic tensions. It's hard for a non-Dutch person, he would say, to get justice there. And as he gained influence and lands and wealth, and he became a member of the governor's council, which functions sort of like the state senate does today, except it was handpicked by the governor, and it usually was composed of the leading members of the leading families of the state. So Johnson, got his wish, and we saw Daniel Campbell became a magistrate, and then there were certain Dutch folks in Schenectady who worked closely with Johnson on business matters. A couple of them became magistrates as well, and so then Johnson had, a friendly court here. And he was interested in Schenectady's affairs when Schenectady had trouble with political factions. There were some battles over who was going to be elected to the colonial legislature for Schenectady's seat. Both sides would go and ask Johnson for support because he had so much wealth and did so much business. He could subtly let his contacts in Schenectady who did business with him know which way he leaned, and then kind of the implied idea was that if you wanted to keep doing business with Johnson, you wanted to keep him happy. And of course, anything that he was buying for the Indian trade, he had funds directly from London to buy, so he could pay you in script. It was still basically a check, but it was denominated in sterling, in British sterling, which was the most valuable on the planet. So a very powerful guy, a lot of political influence that extended to Schenectady. He did get upset at one point when Schenectady was about to get a town charter. Schenectady folks had reached out to Duanesburg, to the folks up there, to James Duane, who owned Duanesburg, and tried to ask him if he wanted to include Duanesburg in the town of Schenectady. Mm-hmm. Johnson kind of got wind of that and wrote a very angry letter to the colonial government that Schenectady was trying to grow beyond its boundaries. I mean, it was kind of headed towards Warrensburg, and he didn't want any kind of encroachment on his land or his sphere of influence. So he had a kind of an up and down with Schenectady.
did it make perfect sense to you to conclude with the year 1800? Would you have liked to have gone on a few more decades, or what?
Well, I was just trying to kind of complete Susan's original plan, which was to take it up to the point of becoming a city, which is actually in 1798. But 1800 is a nice round number. You get into a little further, 1809, for instance, you get into the birth of Schenectady County. And that would have been a nice, you could definitely see where that would be, that could also be a fitting place to stop. You've created the city, and then, 11 years later, the county is established, and now you have it's kind of Schenectady as we know it today, county and city. But that's okay. That'll be for the person who does volume 3.
That was my next question. Volume 3, can we find somebody to do that and have it cover the whole 19th century, or
Well,
do we need a volume 3 and a volume 4?
that's a good question. I would think that the whole 19th century is a big, boy, that's a big piece of history for Schenectady. You might need a volume 3 up to maybe, say, the Civil War, or the end of the Civil War, and then pick it up from there, so that volume 4 would have the whole GE story, and you can start the Alco story before the Civil War, and then that kind of carries you over into volume 4.
Do you have some kind of project coming up you want to tell us about, or you're just resting for a while?
Well, I'm resting for a little bit. I'm back to just mostly being an attorney at this point. But I do have an idea in mind. I've been reading and researching more merchants' letter books from the time of Daniel Campbell's letter book from the late 1700s, early 1800s, and there were a network of merchants who all knew one another. There were James Finn and Alexander Ellis, who were here in Schenectady at the same time as Campbell, but they were such ardent loyalists that they decamped for Canada just before the war started, and pretty much liquidated their holdings. But they went on to be huge players in the Canadian fur trade, where they kind of consolidated what they call the Northwest Company with the XYZ Company, with the Hudson's Bay Company. They served as financial backers for merchants up there, and they actually started the first Bank of Montreal. In fact, I think both Sarah Ferguson, who I think is still Duchess of York, and Lady Di were related back through the Ellis branch. That's not the same Ellis as Ellis Hospital. That's a different family. But yeah, so yeah, and so their merchant books are around, their letter books are around, and some of the folks they worked with as associates, their letter books are in various museums around the country. That I think would be really interesting to try to pull some information from those together. Also, maybe the papers. Nobody's ever put together the papers of Henry Glenn.
Oh.
And Henry Glenn, lived here in Schenectady. He was involved with he's a Glenn family member. He was a merchant. The Glenn family also had extensive boat building operations here on the river for building the boats that conducted trade and transport up and down the Mohawk into the river system all the way to the Great Lakes and Detroit and beyond. But he was also a quartermaster during the war. He was in the Congress, as I recall. I think he might have been in the Congress that debated the Constitution. But his papers are spread all over. There's some here. There's various institutions have chunks of Glenn papers. But I think if you brought all those together and put them together in a way that's follows the pattern, or is similar to the pattern in the papers of Sir William Johnson, where they're annotated, and the references that are in the papers, there are footnotes that tell you like what that person is, or why they're important, or what was going on, and you can relate things to the time. That would be a little interesting look at a man whose career really got going, and he grew up, and I think he was in the militia that supported, the English side in the French and Indian War, and then he's on the Revolution. In the Revolution, he's a patriot, fighting against England, and he's in government, and he's had a really wide-ranging life.
We've been talking about Schenectady Genesis, Volume 2, The Creation of an American City from an Anglo-Dutch Town, with author John Gehring. John, thank you very much.
Bill, thanks for having me, and thanks to the Schenectady County Historical Society for putting this whole thing together and making time and space for us to do it. And for anybody out there who's listening, if you're not a member of the Historical Society, won't you consider becoming one? You can go to the website, and there's a link there that'll take you to the various options. But it's a great organization, well worth belonging to. And once we're able to be fully open again after this virus passes over us, then you'll find there's a wealth of activities for families, for interested parties, people interested just in history. There's a tremendous number of stories to be told about Schenectady County, and they're doing a great job telling them.
Thank you. John's book is available at the Schenectady County Historical Society or schenectadyhistorical.org online. It's also available at the Open Door Bookstore in downtown Schenectady.